John Wayne had just drawn his Colt for the fifth take when the prop master's voice cut through the desert air with two words that made the entire crew stop breathing. Wrong gun. Wait, because what happens between that warning and the moment Wayne finally lowers his hand will test every rule he swore he'd never break in front of a camera. The Arizona sun hung merciless over the western town set, bleaching the wooden storefronts until they looked like bones left too long in the desert. It was the kind of heat that made men move slow and think slower. Wayne had been standing in the middle of the main street since 7 that morning, running through the same scene, while the director searched for something he couldn't quite name. Write in the comments, where are you listening to this story from? And what time is it right now? 4 takes had already burned through the morning. The first 2 had lighting problems. The third died when a horse at the end of the street decided to whinny during Wayne's final line. The fourth came close, but the director called for one more. Now it was take 5, and Wayne was tired in the way that doesn't show on camera, but sits heavy in a man's bones. He stood on his mark, hand hovering near the holster, waiting for the word that would start the scene. The actor playing the hired killer stood 30 feet away, sweat running down his face. Action! Wayne's eyes narrowed. His shoulders settled into that distinctive stance. His right hand began its practiced descent toward the gun, fingers spreading in anticipation of the grip. And then the voice came. Wrong gun. The prop master was running. Marcus Webb, sprinting across the dusty street with his arms waving. Mr. Wayne, don't move. For God's sake, don't move your hand. Look at Wayne's face in this frozen moment, because what you see isn't confusion or anger. It's recognition, the understanding of a man who has spent 3 decades on film sets and knows exactly what those words mean. Wrong gun means the weapon in your holster isn't the blank firing replica. Wrong gun means someone made a mistake that could end with a body on the ground. Wayne's hand stopped moving. It hung in the air beside his hip, frozen mid-reach, as still as if it had been carved from stone. Every muscle in his body locked into place. Nobody move, Wayne said, and his voice carried across the silent set with the authority of a man who expected to be obeyed. Nobody takes a step until Marcus tells us what we're dealing with. The prop master reached Wayne and bent over double, hands on his knees, gasping for breath. When he looked up, there were tears cutting tracks through the dust on his face. The Colt, he managed to say between ragged breaths. The hero Colt. It's not the prop, it's the reference piece. The live one. He had to stop and swallow hard before he could continue. I just checked the cabinet. The prop is still in its case. Someone switched them. Notice the way the air changes when those words sink in. The hero Colt was supposed to be a modified replica, incapable of firing anything but blanks. But the reference piece, the gun for close-up shots, was a genuine 1873 single-action army revolver, fully functional and potentially loaded. Step back slowly, Wayne said, his voice steady as granite, even though his hand was 6 inches from a weapon that might kill the man standing 30 feet in front of him. Everyone stepped back. Give Marcus room to work. The crew obeyed without question. They moved like people in a dream, slow and careful, their eyes fixed on Wayne and the gun that nobody could see but everyone could feel. Wait, because this is where the story starts to become something more than a close call on a movie set. Marcus Webb approached Wayne with the exaggerated care of a man defusing a bomb. His hands were shaking so badly that he had to clasp them together to keep them still. I'm going to reach for the holster, Mr. Wayne. I need you to keep your hand exactly where it is. Don't move. Don't even breathe hard. I know how to stand still, Marcus. Just do what you need to do. The prop master's fingers touched the leather of the holster. Slowly, infinitely slowly, he drew the revolver free and held it up to the light. Everyone who could see it stopped breathing. It was beautiful, in the terrible way that weapons sometimes are. Blued steel and walnut grips, the brass of the cartridges, visible in the cylinder, catching the desert sun like tiny golden promises of violence. This was no prop. This was a killing tool, designed for one purpose only. Loaded, Marcus said, his voice barely above a whisper. Full cylinder, 6 rounds. The words fell into the silence like stones into a well. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The only sound was the hot wind pushing dust across the empty street. Then Wayne moved. Not toward the gun. He knew better than that. He moved toward the actor, who had been standing 30 feet away, waiting for the scene to play out, waiting for Wayne to draw and fire. "Tommy," Wayne said, and his voice was gentle now, the kind of gentle a man uses when he's trying not to scare someone who's already scared. "Tommy, look at me." The young actor's face had gone gray. He was staring at the gun in Marcus's hand with eyes that couldn't quite believe what they were seeing. "That was pointed at me," Tommy said. "The last 4 takes, that was pointed at me. I know. You could have, if you'd pulled the trigger. I know." Wayne put his hand on Tommy's shoulder, steadying him the way you'd steady a man who was about to fall. "But I didn't. And you're standing here talking to me. That's what matters right now. Stop for a second and look at this scene from above. There's Wayne, his hand on a young actor's shoulder. There's Marcus Webb, holding the loaded weapon. There's the director, frozen behind his camera. And there's everyone else, all of them standing in a loose circle around a disaster that didn't happen, but easily could have. Listen carefully, because the real story isn't about the gun. The gun is just metal and wood, and the potential for tragedy. The real story is about what Wayne does next, and why it matters. "Marcus," Wayne's voice cut through the stunned silence. "Who loaded the prop cabinet this morning?" The prop master looked up, his face still pale, but his eyes focusing now on something other than the weapon in his hands. "I did. Same as always. I checked every piece before we left the prop truck." "And the reference piece? The live gun? It should have been locked in the secondary cabinet. The one with the key that only I carry." Marcus's hand went to his pocket, came out with a small brass key. "It's still here." The lock wasn't forced. Someone had to. He stopped, the implications hitting him like a physical blow. Someone had to have another key. Wayne nodded slowly. Someone with access to the prop department. Someone who knew which gun was which and where they were kept. His jaw tightened in a way that anyone who knew him would recognize as dangerous. Someone who made a decision that could have killed Tommy Morrison. Remember what I said about the rules Wayne swore he'd never break? This is where you start to understand what those rules were. The director finally found his voice. His name was Howard Clement, a competent man who had worked with Wayne before.
"John, let's not jump to conclusions. This could have been an accident. A simple mistake. Someone grabbed the wrong gun in a hurry."
"No." Wayne cut him off with a single word. "This wasn't an accident. You don't accidentally swap a prop for a loaded weapon. You don't accidentally put live rounds in a gun that's going to be pointed at a man's chest. Someone did this deliberately, and I want to know who, and I want to know why." The set went very quiet. Everyone understood what Wayne was saying, and everyone understood what it would mean if he was right. Notice what's happening here. In any other circumstance with any other star, the studio would already be moving to shut this down. But Wayne wasn't any other star. "I want the police," Wayne said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "I want a full investigation. And until we know exactly how this happened and who was responsible, nobody leaves this location." Clement stepped forward, his voice dropping to something meant to be private, but carrying anyway in the desert stillness. "John, be reasonable. If we call the police, this becomes a story. The studio won't." "I don't care what the studio wants." Wayne's eyes were hard as flint. "A man almost died today. A young man with a wife. and a baby on the way. Almost caught a bullet because someone put a loaded gun in my holster. You want me to be reasonable about that?" He turned to face the crew, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "Let me make something clear. I've been making pictures for over 30 years. In all that time, I've never had a serious accident on any set where I was the lead. Not because I'm lucky, not because I'm careful, because I don't tolerate carelessness when people's lives are at stake." He paused, letting the words sink in. What happened today wasn't carelessness. It was something else, and until I know what it was and who did it, I'm not picking up another prop gun, and nobody on this production is pointing anything at anybody. Wait, because this is where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. From the back of the crowd, a voice spoke up, quiet at first, then louder as people turned to look. It was me. The speaker was a young man, maybe 25, with the lean build of someone who'd spent his life working outdoor jobs. He was dressed in the clothes of a below-the-line crew member. His name was Carl Jennings. "I switched the guns," Carl said, his voice steady, but his hands trembling at his sides. "I had a copy of Marcus's key made 3 weeks ago. I've been waiting for the right moment." The crew parted as Wayne walked toward him, and there was something in Wayne's stride that made people step back. "Why?" Wayne asked, and the single word carried more weight than a speech. Carl met his eyes, and there was something there that wasn't quite sanity, a desperation that had been burning too long and too hot. "Because you killed my brother." The words hit the silent set like a thunderclap. Wayne stopped walking, his face showing something that might have been surprise, or might have been the first flicker of understanding. "In Korea," Carl continued, his voice rising, "Danny Jennings. He was 18 when he enlisted. He did it because he watched your movies his whole life. Because you made war look like glory." Tears were streaming down his face. "He died in a rice paddy in 1951, shot in the back, trying to save his squad leader. Listen, because this is the moment that will define how everyone on that set remembers John Wayne." The silence stretched out like a held breath. Everyone was waiting to see what Wayne would do. The crew, the director, the young man who had just confessed to attempted murder. The whole world seemed to narrow down to 2 men standing in the dust of a fake Western street, one of them carrying 30 years of guilt he didn't know he had. Before we go any further, you need to understand something about John Wayne. Behind the swagger and the tough talk, there was a man who had spent his career playing heroes while knowing he had never been tested the way real heroes are tested. He had made war movies by the dozen, but he had never served. Somewhere deep inside, that knowledge sat like a stone in his chest. Wayne looked at Carl Jennings for a long moment. Then he did something that nobody expected. He nodded. "Your brother was a brave man," Wayne said quietly. "He did something I never had the courage to do. He put on a uniform and went where the bullets were real." He paused. I'm sorry for your loss. I'm sorry if anything I said or did played any part in his decision to enlist. And I'm sorry that you've been carrying this pain so long that you thought making someone else suffer was the only answer." Carl's face crumbled. The desperate anger that had sustained him for years seemed to drain out of him. His legs buckled, and 2 grips caught him and lowered him to the ground. "I wanted you to know what it felt like," Carl sobbed. "I wanted you to know what it's like to lose someone because of a gun and a lie about glory." Wayne knelt in the dust beside him. John Wayne, the biggest star in Hollywood, kneeling in the dirt next to a man who had tried to kill someone just to make him hurt. "I do know," Wayne said. "Not the way you know it, but I've known since 1945, when the boys started coming home in boxes. I've known every time I shook hands with a veteran and saw in his eyes that he knew something I never would." He put his hand on Carl's shoulder. "Your brother was the real thing. I'm just pretend." Notice what happens next. because it's the part of the story that nobody who was there ever forgot. Wayne stood up and turned to face Howard Clement. "Call the police," he said. "This man needs to be held accountable for what he did. Someone could have died today." Clement nodded, already reaching for the production assistant with the radio. "But Howard," Wayne's voice stopped him. "When you make the call, you tell them everything. You tell them why he did it. You tell them about Danny Jennings and Korea and everything else. And you make sure someone from the studio is there when his family is notified, because they're going to need help, and they're going to need to know that I asked for them to have it." The director stared at Wayne for a moment, then nodded again, slower this time, with something like respect in his eyes. The police arrived within the hour. Carl Jennings was taken into custody without resistance. The fight had gone out of him the moment he confessed, and what was left was just a broken young man who had lost his brother and didn't know how else to grieve. The investigation that followed would determine that he had indeed made a copy of the prop master's key and switched the guns before the day's first setup. If Wayne had drawn and fired during any of the 5 takes, Tommy Morrison would have taken a bullet at center mass from 30 feet away. The outcome would have been certain. But Wayne hadn't fired. And in the strange arithmetic of fate and chance that governs all our lives, that made all the difference. Wait. Because the story doesn't end with the police cars driving away. That evening, after the set had been cleared, and the sun had painted the sky orange and red, Wayne sat down and wrote a letter. The letter was addressed to the Jennings family in Ohio, Carl's mother and father, who had lost one son to war. Wayne wrote for over an hour, filling pages with words that came harder than any dialogue. He wrote about Danny, even though he had never known him. He wrote about the responsibility that comes with pretending to be something you're not. He wrote about guilt and grief and the terrible weight of wondering if the things you say and do actually matter to anyone. And at the end, he wrote a check. Not a small one. Enough to pay for Carl's legal defense. Enough to help the family with whatever came next. He folded the check inside the letter, sealed the envelope, and gave it to a production assistant with instructions to mail it first thing in the morning. Some stories you never tell the press. Some things you do because they're right, not because anyone will ever know you did them. Remember the loops we opened earlier? Here's where they start to close. The production resumed 3 days later, after new safety protocols had been implemented, and every weapon on set had been inspected, re-inspected, and locked in a cabinet with multiple keys held by multiple people who had to sign off together before anything could be removed. Wayne insisted on all of it, and the studio, shaken by what had almost happened, agreed without argument. The scene that had almost ended in tragedy was finally shot on the 4th day. Wayne drew his prop gun, verified empty by 3 different people, including Wayne himself, and fired at the hired killer, played by Tommy Morrison. Tommy clutched his chest and fell dramatically into the dust, and the director called cut, and everyone cheered because the take was perfect. But watch Wayne's face as he holsters the gun after that scene. Watch the way his hand lingers on the grip for just a moment longer than necessary. Watch the way his eyes find Tommy Morrison, still brushing dust off his costume, and stay there until the young actor looks up and nods that he's okay. That's not acting. That's a man who will never again take for granted that the weapon in his hand is harmless. Listen, because what happens over the next few months will show you who John Wayne really was when the cameras weren't rolling. Carl Jennings went to trial 6 months later. The charge was attempted murder, reduced to reckless endangerment after the prosecutor reviewed all of the circumstances and concluded that Carl's intent had been to cause emotional harm rather than physical death. The defense argued temporary insanity brought on by prolonged grief, and the jury, most of whom had lost someone in Korea or knew someone who had, was sympathetic. Carl was sentenced to 5 years in state prison, of which he would serve 3. Wayne attended the sentencing hearing. He didn't speak, didn't make a statement, didn't try to influence the outcome one way or another. He just sat in the back of the courtroom and watched as a young man who had tried to hurt him was led away in handcuffs. Afterward, Wayne walked out of the courthouse and straight into a crowd of reporters who had somehow learned he would be there. They shouted questions at him, the usual chaos of flashbulbs and competing voices, all trying to get a quote for the evening edition. Wayne stopped, considered for a moment, and then spoke. Carl Jennings lost his brother in Korea. His brother was a hero, and heroes deserve to be remembered. That's all I have to say. Then he got in his car and drove away, leaving the reporters to make of it what they would. Notice the ripples spreading out from that single statement. By the next morning, the story wasn't about the crazy man who had tried to kill someone on a John Wayne movie set. It was about Danny Jennings, a young soldier who had died saving his squad leader. It was about sacrifice and grief and the terrible cost of war. It was about something real, hidden inside something that could have been just another Hollywood scandal. The picture wrapped on schedule, despite everything. When it was released the following year, it did well at the box office. Not Wayne's biggest hit, but solid enough to keep the studio happy. The reviews were good, the action was praised, and buried in the credits, just before the copyright notice, was a dedication that Wayne had insisted upon over the studio's objections. In memory of the men and women who served in Korea, and especially those who gave their lives so others could come home. But here's the part of the story that almost nobody knows. 3 years after the trial, Wayne received a letter. It was postmarked from Ohio, and the return address showed the name Jennings. For a moment, he thought it might be from Carl's parents, perhaps a request for more help, or a note of thanks for what he had done. It was from Carl himself. The letter was written on lined paper, the kind they gave inmates for correspondence. The handwriting was careful, almost childlike, as if Carl had taken great pains to make every word legible. "Dear Mr. Wayne," it began, "I know I don't have any right to write to you after what I did. I don't expect you to read this, and I wouldn't blame you if you threw it away without opening it. But I needed to try to say something I should have said a long time ago." Wayne sat down in his study and read the letter through twice. Carl wrote about his brother Danny. Really wrote about him. Not just as a symbol of grief, but as a person. He wrote about the games they played as kids, the dreams they shared, the way Danny always wanted to be the hero in every story they invented. He wrote about the day Danny enlisted, and the pride their parents felt, and the fear that nobody talked about, because talking about it might make it real. And he wrote about the day the telegram came. "I know now that what I did was wrong," Carl wrote. "I knew it was wrong when I was doing it, but I couldn't stop myself. The anger had been building for so long that it felt like the only thing holding me together. If I let go of it, I thought I might disappear." He went on to describe his time in prison, the therapy he'd received, the slow process of learning to grieve without destroying himself in the process. He wrote about meeting other inmates who had lost brothers and fathers and sons, men who understood his pain, even if they couldn't condone what he'd done with it. "The hardest part," Carl wrote, "was accepting that Danny's death wasn't your fault. It wasn't anyone's fault except the enemy who shot him. Danny made his choice because he was brave, and he wanted to help people. That's who he was. I was so busy being angry at you that I forgot to be proud of him." The letter ended with a simple request. "When I get out of here, I want to do something to honor my brother's memory. Something real, something that might help other families who've lost someone. I don't know yet what that will be, but if you ever have any ideas, I'd be grateful to hear them." Wayne put the letter down and sat for a long time in the gathering darkness of his study. Then he picked up a pen and began to write. Wait, because this is where the story reaches its true ending. 6 months later, Carl Jennings was released from prison. He walked out of the gates with nothing but a small bag of personal belongings and a bus ticket home. Waiting for him in the parking lot was his mother, his father, and a man they had never met. Wayne had driven through the night to be there at the prison gates. He shook Carl's hand, spoke briefly with his parents, and handed Carl an envelope. Inside was a letter of introduction to a veterans organization in Ohio, along with a check large enough to fund a scholarship program in Danny Jennings' name. The scholarship would help the children of fallen soldiers attend college, something Danny himself had never had the chance to do. "I can't bring your brother back," Wayne told Carl. "Nobody can. But maybe together we can make sure people remember who he was and what he did." Carl stood there in the prison parking lot, holding an envelope that represented more money than he had ever seen. And for the first time since his brother died, he didn't feel angry. He felt something else entirely, something he had almost forgotten existed: hope. Danny himself went back to work after 3 full months of recovery. He stayed in the business for another 30 years, eventually becoming a safety coordinator himself, one of the best in the industry, known for his meticulous attention to detail and his absolute refusal to cut corners. He kept a photograph on his desk, a picture of himself and John Wayne, taken on the day the crew gathered on the Western Street set, 2 men covered in dust and exhaustion, but somehow still standing. Years later, at Wayne's funeral in 1979, Danny was one of many hundreds of people who came to pay their respects. He stood in the back of the crowd, his son right beside him, a tall young man now, strong and bearing the name of a legend. When someone asked Danny what John Wayne had really been like, he thought for a long moment before answering. He was a man who understood that what you do when nobody's watching matters more than what you do when the cameras are rolling, Danny said. And he was a man who believed that everyone deserves a second chance, even the people who try to hurt you. If you want to hear what happened to the Danny Jennings Scholarship Fund, because yes, it's still running today, over 60 years later, tell me in the comments. Some stories don't end when the credits roll. Some stories are still being written, one scholarship at a time, by people who never knew the soldier they're honoring, but carry his memory forward anyway. And if Danny Jennings could see what his death set in motion, not just the grief and anger, but also the healing and hope, I think he would have smiled wide, not because his name lives on, but because his sacrifice still matters. That's the part they don't put in the movies. But maybe that's the most important part of it all.